Hey friends, thank you all for joining today's panel called A Systems Approach to Climate Change Programming, Understanding Unintended Consequences and Achieving Transformative Change. My name is Edgar Ngabuyama, and I am an Innovation Advisor at RTI International, and I'm your host for this panel discussion today. So I will start by answering three questions about us, about RTI. The first one is, who are we? RTI International is a world-class research institute and a leading global development organization. Second question, where are we? We are headquartered in the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina in the United States. However, a substantial number of our staff are located in countries and regions we want to serve. And the last question is, what do we do? We work with local partners around the world, applying our research and global development expertise to solve complex and shared challenges. And today I'm excited to be joined by experts who bring diverse perspectives and insights to this topic. From RTI International, we have Tracy Mitchell, our Director of Resilience and Climate Adaptation. We have two innovation advisors, Amanda Rose and Tawanda Muzingi. And we are also delighted to have Maria Mateo Sorprong from Milliman, where she assumes the role of Director of Communications and Knowledge Management. So we also have Ciara, our Mashid's Deputy Energy Leads at 60 decibels. So to get started, the climate system, what is that? The climate system, we know it's a highly complex global network that encompasses, the atmosphere, the oceans, the cryosphere, the land surface, and the biosphere, and also the interactions between them. Now, climate change programming has first to account for these components and also incorporate multiple economic, cultural, and societal dimensions. And we know the interactions between these dimensions and these components are not constant, which makes our system extremely dynamic. And even when we attempt to address one specific challenge related to one specific component of the climate system, we still must understand the spatial and temporal dimensions of the interferences that these components may have. And this is what we call a systems approach, right? Now, the global community of international development practitioners is extremely good at identifying project risks, developing risk mitigation strategies, and also planning for risk responses. And now we are seeing more and more discussions around how to identify unintended consequences. And I define this new trend, this new process as risk analysis 2.0. It means we take one step further. We go beyond the boundaries of a given intervention, and we systematically apply a so what methodology until these unintended consequences are unveiled and become risks. And we know how to manage risk. Now, I'm now delighted to introduce my brilliant colleague Amanda Rose, who will provide some practical approaches and also elaborate on how, and I would say why, we must feel accountable for what happens beyond the conventional boundaries of a project lifecycle. Amanda.
Awesome. Thanks, Edgar. Such a wonderful introduction, and really pleased to be with you all today to talk about this concept and this work that we're doing and we're putting out in the world to kind of generate discussion and hopefully get some feedback from you all, because it's a mighty big concept and challenge that we're all tackling together. And so just really welcome that community to dialogue around anticipating and managing unintended consequences. Now, certainly, we as individual practitioners in the development space care deeply about minimizing the potential downside effects of our work and maximizing the potential upsides. And so this conversation isn't meant to suggest that we aren't already trying to anticipate and manage unintended consequences in our efforts. However, what we're realizing in that space that Edgard so well described of those compounding uncertainties, that we at RTI and our partners are really starting to see that we need to take more of an organizational approach to unintended consequences. And we need to really be more systematic as we think about these concepts as a collective. So before we really dive in, I want to define what we mean by unintended consequence in this context. And what we're talking about is a significant, unexpected outcome that could be positive or negative of a purposeful action that is not intended. It is important that we note the word significant because we're talking about consequences that rise to the threshold of severity, whether in breadth or depth of impact that warrant our collective attention. So we're not talking about those one-off anecdotal pieces of evidence of something going wrong or better than expected, but really that systems response, the revenge effect, as Edward Tenner talks about it, that we really need to pay attention to at that collective level. And another caveat, we're not talking about anticipating all potential unintended consequences. That would be a fool's errand. That would be impossible to do. But what we can do is by paying attention to historical patterns, by thoughtfully engaging our local partners, and understanding really how systems work, not how we want them to work, but how they really work, we can do a little bit better at being systematic in anticipating and proactively managing some of these things that we know may manifest after we achieve our intended outcomes. And so as Edgard was saying, you know, we appreciate as development professionals, we're working in this complexity. And so we know that it's not a matter of if, but when, where, and to what extent unintended consequences emerge. And it's because of the kind of dynamics and the characteristics of these complex adaptive systems, which we are familiar with. We hear this language. We hear about interconnectedness, we experience it in our work, we know about nonlinear change. There's no 1 + 1 = 2 necessarily. And we appreciate that effects propagate and they produce wide-ranging and long-lasting secondary consequences that may have little to do with where we started. And so we appreciate this as the context in which we're working. But now we really need to ask ourselves, and the work ahead of ourselves is to ask, well, what do we do about this? How do we operate differently as development professionals, given that these uncertainties, these complexities are only compounding? So we appreciate that we need a different approach to planning, implementation, and partnering. We have to really embrace the fact that there are clear limits to what we can know and understand in advance. Our analysis will always be incomplete, and certainly coming from a research institute, that is kind of hard to accept sometimes, but it's true, and we're gonna face surprises. And so the antidote to this is really to embrace complexity as part of the planning, implementation, and partnering process. We're not going to ward it off, but we really need to kind of inculcate it. And this proposed approach for managing unintended consequences is one small offering we hope that can help us do that better. So one of the things we've been working with internally and with our partners is trying to better define, get a more precise language around what happens after the intended outcome is achieved. So often we We see logic models, and we have pretty good vocabulary about kind of how we build up to the intended outcomes and the intended impacts of our work. And yet what comes after that, the what else, is really kind of blank slate for us often. And so we've been really trying to put together a shared vocabulary around how kind of that ripple effect takes shape, kind of building from intended outcome to a plausible event into that unintended consequence that we defined previously. We also are looking back into history. We have so much to learn. And these 5 root causes of unintended consequences were actually put forward by Robert Merton in the 1930s. There's a scholarship, there's a body of study that has been with us for a very long time. And so really kind of to move forward, taking that look back and embracing the history of unintended consequences and trying to understand these root causes, they're really, if you look at them, ignorance, error, short-termism, dogmatism, and self-defeating prophecies are really based in kind of the mindset with which we take forward our work and our organizational structures. And so there's a lot to learn, and we're trying to kind of really anchor in that history as we consider how we might go forward. So we're putting forward a proposed approach, a repeatable process that we can use to anticipate and manage unintended consequences in a bit more of a systematic, organizational way. Now, this looks a lot like a traditional program cycle, and we did that purposefully because we really want to, for ourselves and our partners, kind of think about managing unintended consequences as an extension of the work we're already doing. It's not something separate. It is not something new that we kind of set aside and do if we have time, but rather, how do you find smart ways to nest the anticipation and the management of unintended consequences in our day-to-day work? So right alongside that pursuit of intended outcomes and impact, we are also thinking about what else might happen. And we're really prioritizing those most likely and severe unintended consequences that may emerge. We're gathering signals proactively. We're not just looking at what's working, but we're asking the other questions about what else we are learning. And then we're proactively mitigating along the way. And finally, as I said up front, this is a learning process for us. We are not presenting this as a baked approach, baked concepts that we, are putting out as fixed, by no means. We are still learning, and we certainly welcome your feedback, your experience in trying to do this well as your own organization or other partners are also kind of working in this space. Wanted to share a couple lessons just in case that would be helpful for others who are thinking about this. Certainly, we've already talked about the shared vocabulary, the integration of this approach across the programmatic cycle, so it's really nested in the day-to-day. Additionally, kind of that important role of local voices who are so close to the signals of change that can really be very important kind of communicators and sharers of information that we can act upon. And then the very important role of synthesis and pattern identification. Again, we're not trying to find the one-offs that can really be managed at a project level, but rather where are we seeing the system level kind of effects that are emerging that we need to think about as a collective. So with that, want to say thank you for allowing me to share a little bit of our thinking today, and excited to hear from our panel. And so Edgar, I will hand it back to you and really appreciate the time to share.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. This presentation was fantastic. We have worked for some time now together, but I still learn from listening to you, so which is great. And indeed, it is important to understand how systems work and not how we want them to work. And also something that you said that is very interesting is that there is often a confusion between unintended consequences, risks, and negative outcomes. And that is why it is important to have good definitions And as we know, good definitions are valuable assets. They allow us, global practitioners, to evaluate situations better, to have more meaningful and powerful conversations with stakeholders and also communities we intend to serve. And finally, yes, understanding the root causes for unintended consequences is key for organizations to build capacity and develop mitigation strategies. Equally important, it is to develop a repeatable management approach to unintended consequences that can be embedded in programming cycles. Very great presentation. Thank you, Amanda. So before we start our panel discussion, I would like to encourage our attendees to leave comments and questions in the chat. And although we will not be able to address them live, we will be happy to get in touch afterwards. So the goal of this panel discussion is to reflect on what Amanda just shared with us and use these insights to frame key learnings from past experiences and ultimately suggest or propose steps for moving forward as a global team, as a global community. So my first question is for Tracy. So Tracy, we know that climate change poses challenges to food security. So as a food security expert, can you please share with us some of the unintended consequences you have experienced in the past and how you think you might apply the proposed methodology for uncovering unintended consequences in your work?
Yeah, thanks very much for that introduction. It's great to be here. So yeah, I've spent a lot of time as a practitioner in the field, mostly working in agriculture and food security. And I think just like many of the people participating in this session, we're familiar with, a wide variety of unintended consequences based on our past experience. So within the food and agriculture space, some of the unintended consequences I've experienced is, for example, we're generally trying to introduce climate smart agricultural inputs. For example, improve varieties of seeds that are drought tolerant or have other types of characteristics. And when we do that, we're teaching people how to use them, we're making them available. But one of the unintended consequences of that often is that those inputs are generally more expensive than the unimproved inputs. And so farmers have to have access to credit or have cash reserves to be able to purchase them and utilize them and benefit from them. And so when we don't couple agricultural credit or access to finance with our programming, one of the unintended consequences I think many of us have seen is that we're creating a larger gap between the higher capacity farmers and maybe the more vulnerable farmers. For example, women-headed households and women farmers who have a much more difficult time accessing credit. And so I think this is an example that most of us are familiar with. And this is one of the reasons why we often couple access to finance with our programming to improve climate smart agriculture. Another example that I think many of us have experienced is as we've been trying to commercialize and in some ways modernize agriculture in less developed countries. We're trying to get farmers to switch from subsistence or home-consumed crops to crops that they can market. And, doing that, there's a whole thought behind that it's increasing the family's access to funds, and those funds will be available to buy more food, and that will lead to improved nutrition outcomes. But in many cases, what we've seen is that when the cropping and the agricultural activities are switched from home consumption to market-oriented products that are sold for cash, the dynamics within the households can often change, so that cash is now under the control of the husband versus the wife. And those funds may be spent for a number of different things besides food or things that would lead to direct nutrition outcomes. And and I think there's still a lot of programming focused on how do we counter that unintended consequence. But that's something. It's just another example that I think may resonate with some of the people listening. What I find as really interesting and useful about this new methodology is in both of those examples, those are things that I think we've experienced, and we pull on our experiences as we design new programs or implement new activities. But with this methodology, it gives us a systematic way to identify unintended consequences that not only draws on our own experience, but also encourages us to use local lenses and to utilize local knowledge, as well as to seek other types of research about our activities to identify that. One of the examples I just heard last week, I was in a workshop, and someone from Kenya was mentioning that in their humanitarian programming, they had identified unintended consequences, unintended psychosocial consequences from cash distributions, where the act of receiving a cash distribution disempowered the families and actually led to worse outcomes in comparison to other types of groups that received other types of assistance. And so these are the types of things that I think all of us are committed to, all of us want to work to identify. And using this methodology just gives us a way of systematically incorporating it into our programming, and also by using those local lenses and the local knowledge, which I think we've probably missed out on in the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. This is very, very insightful, and you gave two great examples of unintended consequences, and the experience you shared regarding the implementation of climate-smart new varieties of seeds that needed to be coupled with access to finance is basically another example of a systems approach. And I love the fact that we as a community, we first, recognize our past mistakes, and we want to do better together. We want to include or incorporate a local lens, to incorporate local context in our approach. And it is only if we feel accountable for our actions that we can actually develop resilient systems. So, Maria, now I'm turning to you, and we know that climate adaptation needs a multi-level and holistic intervention to enable resilience. So can you please tell us, how does microinsurance enable climate resilience? We know that the mechanisms for doing so are unknown for most people, including myself, and especially the most vulnerable. So could you also elaborate on these and introduce us to the associated risks and second-order shocks from climate change?
Thanks, Edgar. And yeah, Tracy, thanks so much for bringing up those examples and the different elements you talked about in terms of risk management. So that fits in perfectly to what I wanted to stress here. So from where I sit, from the microinsurance and inclusive insurance space and sectors, lately we've been doing a lot of thinking around this and how do we achieve climate resilience. And as Tracy said, it is kind of this holistic approach. We need to look at how can you reduce people's risks. So maybe that's looking at climate smart agriculture, and the price issue that you mentioned, that is a problem, but how can we reduce risk in that way? And then how can we create access to finance for smallholder farmers, for example? And to add on to that, and kind of where I think about a lot is the insurance piece and risk transfer. So for those types of risks that we can't reduce or we can't retain a bit with finance, how can we transfer it using insurance as a last resort? So that kind of positions insurance as a tool and part of this climate resilience puzzle. And, you know, when it comes to climate change and threats that are part of climate risk, there's really it's really a threat multiplier. So we're not just talking about droughts, for example, but we're talking about what other shocks are caused by that drought. And it, you know, the vulnerability to that, it depends on your different position in society, so gender and income level, et cetera. But so maybe drought is the actual climate risk, the frequency of drought, but then we're looking at what are the effects of that? Do you have to fetch more water as a woman? Do you have security risks now? Do you have lost income opportunities, et cetera? So, so thinking about how we can achieve both financial resilience and non-financial resilience, I think are really important pieces of achieving climate resilience. So when we're thinking about financial resilience and coming back to this unintended consequences idea, I have an example from the insurance world, which is pretty well known, but basically it's this idea of the bigger box effect. So instead of using a claims payout to help with financial relief, like replacing lost income when a breadwinner dies, for example, or investing in education opportunities, that claims payout is instead used for funding a more elaborate funeral, as an example. So we actually investigated this issue a bit in the Philippines with a previous research project and some insurance providers and distribution channels there. And some interesting things that we found were that there was a little bit of a bigger box effect in one case because of the speediness of claims payout. So in the insurance world, having a really fast claims payout is a great thing. And it's honestly, it's a key performance indicator in the microinsurance space. And it's something that people strive for. And in that case, it was a very good trust builder with clients. But again, the unintended consequence was there was a bit of this bigger box effect. And if the goal of insurance in that case is to build financial resilience, then, you know, is this bigger box effect, does that really contribute to that goal? In that case, not really. But then it's very nuanced. And what we found, and part of the research is that understanding at the household level, and this also comes back to what Tracy said about her research, that they found changes in dynamics within the household based on those payments, is understanding at the household level what happens, what kind of risk management strategies are being used, and then timing it according to what's appropriate. So in that case, with the fast claims payout, we found that maybe staggering it or having that payout come a little bit later and letting family take the lead at the beginning of funeral arrangements might actually be a better approach in that case. But it's very nuanced and contextual. So it all really comes down to, can we understand the dynamics at the household level? And I guess that would be my takeaway or my recommendation for combating some of those, Edgar and Amanda, some of those root causes that you mentioned, ignorance, and you also had dogmatism. I mean, insurance industry, there's plenty of dogmatism and a lot of unlearning that needs to happen. But yeah, so to combat that is really, in development sector programming, can we fund projects or research in which we can understand the financial lives of people in their households and design solutions appropriately for that.
Wow, Maria, that was very informative, and I won't tell any lies. You know, I have very limited knowledge in microinsurance, and I'm glad to hear that it is accounted for in climate adaptation programming. And as you mentioned, also understanding the dynamics at all levels and the secondary effect is critical if we want, you know, to develop more resilient systems. So Sierra, we have heard specific examples of unintended consequences within development projects related to climate change and climate risks. So now let's take a step back and look at the broader picture and have a higher or a high level discussion on planning for unintended consequences. So as development practitioners, we often monitor the impact of our interventions. We measure success based on, let's say, achieving certain outcomes. We have very strong indicators and targets. We know how to define and measure them. That's wonderful. But is there anything that we are missing from these approaches? And what could be the potential payoff if we just broadened what we monitor and measure?
Great. Thank you, Edgar, and thank you everybody for having me here today. It's been a really great discussion so far, and I think it's a topic that we often, as practitioners, don't really get the time to sort of step back from, think about, and reflect on. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. You know, in my experience, I found traditional monitoring and evaluation approaches tend to be insufficient because they focus primarily on two things. I think the first is that we often define impact on the intended outcomes we, as funders, as grant makers, want to see, rather than defining impact as described from the point of view of a person who's impacted by a project. And second, we often have constraints, and so we conduct evaluations, hopefully at a baseline, usually only maybe at an inline. And so by doing that, you're only getting an assessment of the work as you're completing a project, which obviously limits your ability to learn and to adapt as the project is underway. But these really stand out to me as limitations to our work because again, they really fail to capture the impact and understandings from people benefiting within those communities. And because once you have done an inline evaluation, you've identified too late the potential areas for scale where you saw success or challenges where you are no longer able to correct them. So in the context of unintended consequences, this really magnifies, in my view, the difficulty I think we face in mitigating and planning for them. It's not hard to see that it would be basically impossible to be reactive or adaptive to unintended consequences as they come up if we're not even monitoring to know whether or not they're happening. So in my view, a more successful approach to this would be to think about learning and evaluation kind of in the way you might think of using a dipstick in a car to monitor your oil levels, right? You take the stick, you put it in the oil, you see whether or not you're at the right levels. And if you're not, you course correct. And so if you took that same approach by hosting more targeted surveying of groups of representative beneficiaries across multiple timestamps in a project, what you're able to see are shifts that are happening in a more sort of real-time manner. And if you're combining that alongside an agile and adaptive project management approach, then you can start to course correct for any unintended consequences you might be seeing as they're coming up in real time. And to your second question about the potential payoffs when it comes to monitoring and learning from unintended consequences, I think identifying these challenges and successes are absolutely critical for promoting the long-term sustainability of a project after a funding grant or after funding or a grant cycle has ended. I think we talk a lot as practitioners about wanting to ensure sustainability in our projects over time, but that's quite hard to achieve if we're not fully aware of the impact we're having on our work. And second, this is a bit of a normative position, but I think, if we as a sector start being open to having really honest conversations about what good things are happening and what bad things might be happening as a result of our work, we can get ultimately closer to serving the communities we're trying to better. I think we've all probably been in enough rooms to see folks who don't represent communities define what impact would be for them. And I think it's time that instead, you go and listen to a woman in East Africa who's using a solar water pump and understand what impacts that's having on her, her family, her household, and her community. Thank you.
Awesome. Very good thoughts and well presented. And I think that's the recipe for a great session of knowledge dissemination. And as you mentioned, identifying unintended consequences is a continuous process. We need to show more agility in our approach. And to recap so far, I heard embracing complexity, good intentions, but not necessarily net positive outcomes. I heard learning from past experiences and developing a more systematic approach. But I would also like our attendees to have a better understanding of who's responsible or accountable for, and who contributes eventually to unintended consequences. So, Tawanda, Mukoma Wangu, how are you today? So,
yes, thank you.
Can you please tell us, because you have worked with multiple organizations across different contexts and geographies, do organizations or do organizational structures contribute to unintended consequences? And the second question would be, how can organizations embrace new concepts of working that could better anticipate unintended consequences and ultimately achieve more positive and sustainable impacts?
Yes, Edgar, thank you. I'm happy to be part of this interesting discussion on unintended consequences. And so far, we have looked at what happens when we are implementing projects in the field and the resulting unintended consequences. But often the time, we forget to look at ourselves as contributors of unintended consequences. And the previous speakers, including Amanda, have alluded to this, that organizational structure in some cases contributes immensely to the origins of unintended consequences. So we at RTI, we pride ourselves in learning, learning from lived experiences, learning from interacting with partners, and learning from interacting with communities. So what we are discussing today is coming from a learning perspective in what we have seen. And based with this, we help organizations or other entities that are interested to learn more about mitigating, anticipating, and preparing for unintended consequences, come up with real solutions. So as an organization, one thing that I think contributes to unintended consequences is the organizational structure, in particular the leadership. The type of leadership that you have can also lead to unintended consequences, because they determine the direction of the programs, they direct the direction of the funding that is coming, and how the staff interact with each other and how they interact with communities. And also the organizational culture within the organizations is also a big deal as a contributor to unintended consequences. So understanding how your leadership works, understanding the organizational structure works, it helps you as a staff member working in the field prepare yourself for what could potentially happen in the communities that you're working. So it just builds an awareness. In many cases, we can't avoid unintended consequences. They are going to happen, but what we need to do is to anticipate and try to mitigate their effects on our communities. So we have heard of a project that we are implementing in some country in East Africa, where staff that are working in a conflict zone were recently diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And this could have been prevented had the leadership been proactive in understanding these potential unintended consequences and help them prepare and design rotations in which somebody is not exposed to those stressful situations over a long period of time. So many people would ask me, so when do we design the organizational aspect? Is it going to be part of our M&E strategy? Is it going to be part of our agile project management strategy? The answer is yes and no, because in many cases, we want the unintended consequences to be a tool that is used in the same way as the HR functions, in the same way as the accounting system. And it should not be the responsibility of the project staff. It should not be the responsibility of the leadership, but it should be the responsibility of everybody who's working in the organization to have that mindset that whatever they do can contribute to unintended consequences. And in particular, we want to avoid the ones that have negative impacts on communities we are working and amplify those that may have the positive contributions. So that's all I'm saying is, before you even go to the field, take an introspective approach and see what is it that is about the organization you're working for and about yourself that can potentially contribute to UCs. I will not repeat what has been said before, but to just highlight that dogmatism is one of the challenges that affects many development organizations. They have people with skill sets, with doctorate degrees, master's degrees, lots of experience. So that can also lead them to think in a certain way and be oblivious to other ways of doing things, and that can contribute immensely to unintended consequences. So taking a humble approach to everything and be open to learning and understanding where you work, your external environment, your internal environment can help us implement projects in a better way and contribute to improving the human condition, which at RTI we strive to do every day.
Wow, yes, this is fantastic and fascinating. So, and I hope you guys are taking notes because a lot is being shared and has to be shared with your leadership as well. And obviously, we cannot know everything as we don't know what we don't know. We tend to look at problems from our own perspective, using our own judgments, and also leveraging our own experience. And the more perspectives we get, the better we can frame and address a specific challenge. And that is why we need diversity and collaboration. And that being said, I'm wondering how and if our approach to identifying unintended consequences is systematically broad enough so we don't trigger consequences that have long-lasting ramifications. So we have a little bit over 7 minutes, and I have still a couple of questions that I would like to ask our panelists. So I will start with Tracy and Maria. If each of you for 1 minute can answer these next questions, that would be very interesting. And then we are going to ask a couple of questions to Tawanda and Sierra. So Tracy and Maria, what are some areas and factors and contexts that if we knew more about could help us better anticipate unintended consequences? So for instance, if we knew more about gender dynamics, social structural models, history of conflicts, how might that impact our understanding of unintended consequences? So Tracy, you want to start?
Sure. So I would change that a little bit and say, we've been increasingly doing resilience assessments at multiple levels in various countries, and we're learning a lot about how shocks and stresses impact local communities, and we're learning about people's resilience capacities and how they utilize those capacities during a shock or stress to respond, adapt, and transform to become more resilient. So, I think using that information as part of the unintended consequences methodology is certainly something we can tap. And I saw in the chat someone was asking about outcome harvesting. That's also something we could tap as a source for unintended consequences analysis. But I would actually add just one thing to that. Not only can for example, that resilience information inform the unintended consequences, it can also, that body of knowledge can help us identify what I would call the risks that lead people to not want to adopt some of the things that we're trying to get them to adopt. They know what the unintended consequences are of say, trying to get them to change a practice or to do something differently. And because they know that unintended consequence, they may decide they don't want to adopt it. But if we understood that unintended consequence, we could then factor that into our programming and have more of a human-centered design to be able to program more effectively. So I think it's sort of a give and take both directions.
So thank you very much, Tracy. Maria, do you have any insights you'd like to share on in addition to that?
Yeah, so just to add on to what Tracy said, that's exactly what I was thinking about actually, is just really understanding, as I said before, at the household level, and sort of understanding that demand side risks and coping strategies that exist in households. And I think what I would add to what Tracy said is, if we can somehow harness that information to engage the private sector. So in insurance, we really try to use that type of information to influence or to be inputs to solution design. So like insurance product design that insurance companies come up with, because they haven't always had such a customer-centric approach or understanding of the nuances of low-income customers especially. So I think, and also understanding that intersection of climate risks and climate and gender are really important, because climate change and climate risks are very different for women than men. And then my last comment, so zooming out from the individual and household level, looking at the project level. So in our recent experience with some development sector projects, we've wanted to leverage or connect and link with other development initiatives to try to have this holistic risk management approach. And sometimes that hasn't been thought about from the beginning of the project, and then it doesn't really work out how we planned. But basically, if there are projects going on around climate smart agriculture or irrigation or whatnot, and we can couple that with projects around insurance and finance, if we can plan that ahead of time, I think it could be more effective. But right now, I don't always see the overlap or collaboration happening at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, actually, both of you, have described sort of, systems approach, understanding different nuances, the interactions between different dimensions, and that's very helpful. For our last question, we have a couple of minutes left. Tawanda and Sierra, you have worked with and for international donors, and sometimes they will be blamed for events that occur decades after the investments are done. And we know it is easy or easier to blame big players, but I feel like all of us are part of the equation and the solution. So very briefly, a couple of sentences. Can you please tell us why we tend, to focus on shorter term and medium term unintended consequences? And also, does our accountability have an expiration date? Sierra, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this really comes back to what I was alluding to before, this idea of program sustainability or project sustainability, the idea that at the end of a grant or a fund cycle, that just because you've exited as an org, you no longer bear responsibility. I think we all know that that isn't true. And so when I think about this, I think what's really important is, you've got to, from the get-go, have sort of the buy-in and support from the community you're working in, and really think about doing program design in a participatory and human-centric way. Because if you're not including those voices and those people within it, and they're not also learning alongside you, or seeing the types of unintended consequences that are coming up, then they'll sort of be left in the dark to some extent after you leave, potentially, with what to do and how to manage that. And, I think we focus on the shorter and the medium term because in some ways they're a lot easier to measure. And that's not an excuse for doing that, but I think that's often why it happens. And so there's a bit of a mental shift, like we need to all make and sort of hold ourselves accountable to be doing better.
All right, thank you. And Tawanda, do you have the last word, so we can wrap up this panel discussion? We have 30 seconds left.
Yes, I think many projects struggle with technology adoption adoption of improved processes to change people's lives. Many communities in many developing countries have been exposed to many projects. So sometimes they know the unintended consequences before even bring your project. So it pays very well to talk to the grassroots level and get their inputs before you design your project, so that you can get guidance on how to implement your project effectively without running into unintended consequences. So if you're struggling with technology adoption, maybe you are not consulting your constituencies because they know the potential harm that can happen 10 years down the line. That's my parting words.
Perfect. Thank you. On this very interesting note, I would like to conclude today's discussion. I hope the insights and the experiences shared by our experts was valuable to you. And remember, knowledge is the sum of experiences and sharing is caring. So thank you all for coming today. Again, massive thank you to the participants. And friends, please remember to leave comments, questions in the chat, and we will be happy to get in touch. Have a blessed day and have a blessed journey.